Okay. I'm not a Mark Twain scholar. I'm a cultural historian, so bear with me. And the second thing I want to mention is that I am going to enlist Professor Thompson to read a couple of quotes for me. So thank you. All right. This paper examines the figure of the humor lecturer and his interaction with Midwestern small-town audiences during the Gilded Age. My inspiration for this study were the notes that the cartoonist Art Young, people who know me, you should know I'm obsessed with Art Young, who grew up in rural Wisconsin, wrote in his memoirs describing the visits from humorists that he and his neighbors awaited with anticipation. Whoops, let me... His comments highlight the role that these visitors played in helping the nation emerge from the Puritan ban against laughter, as he put it. My aim here is to place the humorous lecturer in a larger cultural and historical context. In the decades after the Civil War, newspapers and magazines reached the homes of middle-class Americans in the rural Midwest. The printed jokes read aloud and commented on in the sitting room and around the stove of the general store. Additionally, rural areas were happy to welcome itinerant visitors. Throughout the 19th century, visiting lecturers were a fixture in small-town America, their presence considered a sign of civilization. The establishment of a lecture society indicated that a town was stable and prosperous enough to be interested in cultural matters, and by the antebellum period, about 4,000 societies were actively sponsoring lecturers. Public talks brought information about a wide variety of topics: literature, astronomy, history, customs of faraway places, advice on financial and domestic issues, and other subjects intended to enlighten not a specialized audience, but the whole community. The Lecture Society oversaw finding speakers. It was also in charge of advertising the talks in the town paper and of deciding the hall where the gathering would take place. Before the Civil War, the speakers tended to be local and made between $20 and $100 for their presentations. In the decades following the war, the list of invitees became more selective, and towns were willing to pay several $100s to book a well-known celebrity. Humorists trying to expand their popularity and supplement their income were among those who visited small towns. The lecture lists cautiously identified them as humorists, in particular in the years following the Civil War, when the nation's temper was somber and the full tide of the reaction toward humor had not yet set in, as Clara Burdett, who was married to a humorist, put it. In the following decades, as U.S. society relaxed its moral norms and Americans began to crave entertainment as much as enlightenment, humorists were increasingly welcomed, especially those who were already known to their audiences as newspaper columnists. During the Gilded Age, when many social and professional boundaries were still fluid, the comic lecturer's identity remained undefined. Wearing many hats, adopting a flexible persona, one that could move easily between the realms of high and popular culture, were traits that helped the humorist succeed. Josh Billings was one of the comic lecturers to visit Art Young's town. Walter Blair pointed out in Native American humor that Billings, like other humorists, had tried his hand at multiple endeavors. He had been a farmer, a coal operator, a steamboat captain, before he wrote humorous books and almanacs. His humor, filled with jokes about mules, cows, and everyday challenges that farmers encountered, resonated in rural areas. He even poked fun at the lecture societies that hired him. In one of his paper columns, Advice to Lecture Committees, writing in the folksy language that made him famous, Billings offered a few tips to members of lecture societies who were thinking of booking a speaker. Mr. Billings?
Don't fail to tell the lecturer at least 14 times on your ways from the depot to the hotel that you have got the smartest town in creation. and several men in it are worth over $1 million. 2. If the lecturer should inquire how the comic lecturers had succeeded who had preceded him, don't forget to tell him that they were all failures. This will enable him to guess what they will say about him just as soon as he gets out of town.
Billings also gave advice to his fellow comedians. In Hints to Comic Lecturers, he reflected on the difficulties humorists face when visiting a town. More?
One of the meanest things in comic lecturing employment that a man has to do is to try and make that large class of his audience laugh whom the Lord never intended to laugh.
I love that quote when you look at the faces of those people. There's a quote. This is how it's written. Thank you so much. It is not surprising that people attending comic lectures at times seem puzzled as to what the reaction should be. 19th century Americans associated public speaking with religious, political, or educational topics. They were still getting used to the novelty of a public event where one was supposed to laugh. When well-known humorists such as Josh Billings, Petroleum V. Nasby, or Mark Twain went to small towns to give a talk, they did so as invited guests. They had the local lecture society stamp of approval. But then there was a more questionable visitor, the itinerant humorist who spoke without official sponsorship of a local committee. Most of these comic lecturers never became famous. They hired the halls themselves and paid for their own advertisements, usually located among ads for patent medicines in the local paper. This type of humorist drew from a carnivalesque culture that put him on the margins of society, a tradition that would eventually be supplanted by the growing trend toward marketplace rationalization and the concurrent pressure to conform to respectable and professional standards. For the uninvited, obscure speaker, collaborating with a group, a circus troupe, or a medicine show became a winning strategy. Humorists were showmen, performers trying to make money, and when they attached themselves to other itinerant performing visitors, they were able to reach a larger audience and increase their profits. Humorists joined traveling shows and amused their audiences with a wit that quack doctors and other wannabe businessmen incorporated into their marketing strategy. The comedian's ingenuity became a useful tool for selling products. Throughout the late 19th century, the medical profession became increasingly regulated, but in rural areas where the population often doctored itself with home remedies, traveling medicine shows and the patent medicines they advertised were welcome. Traveling doctors understood that their sales were directly related to the quality of the entertainment their shows provided. The humorist's showmanship, his facility with words, were the doctor's best marketing tool. Robert Jones Burdett was a favorite guest lecturer in the rural Midwest in the 1870s and 80s. Before becoming a humorous lecturer, Burdett had tried his hand at many endeavors and failed at most of them. He had participated in an unsuccessful filibustering expedition in Cuba. He had been a school teacher and a reporter for the Hawkeye Burlington when he decided to join the lecture circuit. Burdett received $50 for his first lecture, which he delivered in Keokuk, Iowa, in 1876. He presented The Rise and Fall of the Mustache nearly 5,000 times. It was a sentimental story of the transition from the childhood of the boy to his manhood in its humorous and pathetic phases. Also widely popular was Burdett's Brakeman at Church, an imaginary conversation with a train operator that gently poked fun at a variety of different Protestant denominations. The religious nuances mostly incomprehensible to today's reader, at least to me. The talk was widely reproduced for advertising purposes by dozens of publishers and read from 100 platforms. Like Josh Billings, Burdett commented on the challenges he faced when trying to amuse a crowd. You naturally expect, if you have an alleged humorous lecture, that you will have a good-natured audience, but it doesn't follow. You may stand before a house that would make an iceberg shiver. You pause long enough to mentally remark to your audience, well, I'll bet you $1,000 you can't hate me half so much as I hate you. And the feeling amply revenged, you go on with your chatter. John Austin Hamlin, an entrepreneur with a traveling circus, a traveling performance tour, and con man extraordinaire, incorporated the humor found in Bourdette's lectures and writings to advertise and sell Hamlin Wizard Oil, a patent medicine that claimed to cure all sorts of illnesses, from cancer to diphtheria to the common cold. His tours included singers, magicians, and on special nights, Hamlin himself looking resplendent in white tie and tails, a costume he wore as he delivered his humorous lectures, cribbed from Robert J. Bourdette's repertoire. Another humorist who helped advertise patent medicines before joining the lecture platform was James Whitcomb Riley, Bourdette's close friend. Like Bourdette, Riley had a colorful background. He was a sign painter who enjoyed writing in verse, skills he put to work when exalting the virtues of his employer's remedies. He was also a shameless con man who was willing to lie if that proved a good marketing strategy, like when he pretended to be blind and to have been cured by one of the tonics he sold. In 1872, Riley joined the Macrillus Company, consisting of a peddler's wagon drawn by 5 horses and driven by an eccentric man with long white whiskers who called himself Dr. S.B. Macrillus. Riley helped the doctor sell his patent medicines, including the blood purifier and the oriental liniment. Riley sang songs, told stories, painted ads, and convinced rural Midwesterners of the miraculous qualities of the concoctions for sale. A few years later, Riley joined Dr. C.M. Townsend and his Wizard Oil Company, another performance troupe that included a band of musicians and comedians in a traveling chariot drawn by horses. Armed with a blackboard, Riley drew illustrations and sketches that exalted the benefits of Dr. Townsend's hair tonics, cholera balms, liver pills, cough drops, and more, and invented testimonials of people who claimed to have been cured of their ailments thanks to the magic oil. As a comedian, he beats them all, said the doctor, referring to Riley's success as entertainer. His friend Bourdette had found a path to respectability by becoming a minister after his success as a humorous lecturer. Riley, too, managed to enter mainstream society in 1880. He joined the lecture platform where he presented himself as a humble Midwestern rural poet. His audiences loved him. Where he presented himself as a humble Midwestern rural poet with a repertoire infused with sentimental, gentle humor. His audiences loved him. The sentimental quality of Riley's humor, which was also found in Bourdette's work and many other humorists, conformed to the Victorian sensibility that characterized this period. As a ruthless capitalist system transformed U.S. society, middle-class Americans embraced sentimentality as the defining element of their domestic life and taste. The result was an evasive, optimistic culture that avoided confronting complex issues. The philosopher George Santayana called this tendency the genteel tradition and criticized its banal and superficial tone. Humorists, according to Santayana, were more conscious than most Americans of the genteel tradition's flaws, of how it produced a distorted version of reality. They used their humor to poke fun at the moralizing and pious sentiment found in so much of American culture, but only up to a point because they had no alternative model to replace it with. And so, with a few exceptions, perhaps Mark Twain's, argued Santayana, most humorists never truly challenged the Gilded Age's moral complacency. Yet, one could argue that humor, especially in this historical context, had a transgressive effect. In 1886, John Whitcomb Riley teamed up with Bill Nye, another humorist and lecturer. Despite Riley and Nye's mild conventional humor, there was a subversive element to their show, mainly that it was a comic lecture at all, a type of show 19th century small-town audiences were still coming to terms with. Was it acceptable to laugh during a lecture? Many wondered. At one of Nye's presentations, an attendee observed, Nye spoke in a voice that could be heard all over the room and said the funniest things I have ever heard from a platform, but nobody laughed. Bill Nye was then known all over the Middle West, and the newspapers were filled with his humor. Every person in the room had read them, but not one of them had ever heard the humorist say them. It was all new to them, and they sat enjoying it, but afraid to laugh, fearing they would miss something he was saying. Okay, I'm ending. Comic lecturers, jacks of all trades, had chaotic professional lives and experienced the ups and downs of one of the most fluid social and economic periods in American history. They helped Americans come to terms with laughter in the public sphere and to mature as engaged audiences. They flirted both with a transgressive carnivalesque tradition and with a culture that upheld Victorian ideals of respectability. For the most part, their work ignored the rougher aspects of the late 19th century, including racial inequalities and economic disparities. Their humor, their playfulness, both undermined their society's drive for efficiency and eased Americans into a world increasingly defined by advertising and consumerism. Comic lecturers embodied the spirit of the Gilded Age. Thank you.